Good evening. Welcome to משכנות שאננים. My name is Moti Schwartz. Welcome to משכנות, to the launch of Forest Dark in Hebrew by Nikoll Karaois. Indeed, we have waited for this book. I think it was the longest break after man walks into a room, the history of love and great house, and we are all excited and can't wait to explore the new work we're celebrating tonight. Nikoll is one of the popular and esteemed writers in the US and in Israel. She is loved by the Israeli audience, and we are very, very happy. She is a longtime friend of us here in Mishkenot, where we had the pleasure to welcome her in recent years in our International Writers Festival, the residency programs, and many other opportunities. So good to have you here with us, Nikoll, and thank you for your friendship. Nikoll will speak tonight with Rana Verbin, a multi-talent in the local literary arena, where she's acting as a translator, writer, voiceover artist, actor, and most recently, a publisher. Congratulations for that, Rana, and we are looking forward for the meeting here on stage soon. Please follow us on Facebook, sign up for our newsletter, watch for our advertising in various platforms. Come and join us in our programs. Coming up, among others, are a special evening with Asaf Gavron and Ohad Pishof, and in the end of December, and the launch of Chaim Be'er's new book about Jerusalem, early January. I want to thank the Minister of Cultural Affairs, the Jerusalem Foundation, and the Dangur Education for their support, and of course to the Mishkenot team headed by Dr. Paulina Stemler, and this evening by Aviv David. During the evening, we will enjoy the music of Daniela Spector, a singer, songwriter, and a music producer, one of the most promising Israeli artists of her generation. Her music is supported by her special voice, and we thought it would be the perfect fit for Nikoll's writing. Enjoy the evening, and now, Daniela Spector.
פעמונים, פעמונים מצלצלים בראשך, אתה לא מבין מה בוער בך, אתה לא יכול להיות כאן או בכל מקום אחר. מה שהיה, מה שיהיה לך הוא צל ארוך קודר, כי יש לך שיר שאיש לא מכיר. פעמונים, פעמונים מצלצלים בתוך הלב, עוד מעט יבוא הזמן שלך, או אולי הוא לא יבוא. אתה חוסך את עצמך לא נותן לאף אחד, כשיבואו לאסוף אותך תוכל לצאת לשם לבד, כי יש לך שיר שאיש לא מכיר. שיר שאיש לא מכיר, והוא אבן בלב, והוא בטן ריקה, והוא דגל לבן, הוא באר עמוקה. יש לך שיר, יש לך שיר, תודה.
Hello. Good evening. That was beautiful. Thank you.
It was. Is this on? Yes. Okay.
Okay, so hello everybody. Hello Nicole. I'll just tell you the lineup of the evening just so you know what to expect. We're going to speak for half an hour and then Daniela will perform another song and then we'll have another about half hour and you'll have maybe 10 minutes for questions. So if you want to ask anything, start thinking about it. And then we'll have 2 more songs and then we will go home. So, I want to start by saying that I loved your book.
Thank you.
I read it in Hebrew and then I read it in English. I like the English a little bit better, but the Hebrew translation is beautiful, so you can feel sure that it's a good job was
I
done.
can sleep tonight.
Yeah, you can sleep tonight. And I think that the second reading was even better for me, and I'm even looking forward to the third and maybe fourth readings because what at first looked to me like a taken apart novel then came together in the second reading. And at first I thought, wow, how am I even going to ask you questions about it? And maybe, I mean, the idea of formlessness was so strong for me at first, in the first reading, that I thought maybe I should just open randomly the book and read, or you will read parts of it, and then we'll talk about different ideas. But then in the second reading, it all fell into place, and I thought, oh, this is actually formed, you know?
Yeah, I very much so. And I mean, I find often that we have an expectation about books that we don't have about other art forms, which is that we only need to read them once and then that's it, we understand them. But we would never say that about a piece of music, for example. We listen to music. If you love classical music, you can listen to Beethoven's last quartets many, many times in your life, and you will understand them differently each time. Or if we love a film, we think nothing of seeing a film 10 times over the course of our life that we love. But somehow about literature, we have a sense that in the same way that we can hear a conversation and feel that we understand it immediately, it's language, we only need it once. And of course, as a writer, but more than that, as a reader, I know that not to be the case. And I think the hope is always, though one rarely gets the chance, the hope is that the work will be read more than once, will be approached at different moments and with different perspectives in a life.
So I want to begin with reading the small paragraph by Dante that is actually in the end of the book.
Yes.
But I think that it's the title of the book, but it also describes, I think, what to me, in the second reading, I felt like this was the subject of the book. I'll ask you if it is soon. But I'll just read it quickly. It's the Dante translation is translated by Longfellow, It says, midway upon the journey of our life, I found myself within a forest dark, for the straightforward pathway had been lost. So I thought that this is a book about separation, about the pain of separation, about the collapse of structure, about standing at the edge of the unknown, about things falling apart. And I wanted to ask, is it true? And did you know all along that this was what you were writing?
No, I never know anything when I set out to write a book, and if I knew, then I would have no need to write that book. It's always, a novel is a kind of searching vehicle, right? It's asking the reader questions, but the writer is asking herself those same questions. What's interesting to me about the chancing upon the title that became the right title is that it happened slowly, and it happened long after the book was already finished. So I wasn't thinking consciously, at least, about Dante, about the idea of getting lost in the forest, about the straightforward path versus getting lost, or the circular path. But in some sense, all of those things were with me. And I'll take a brief detour before I come back to your question. I can tell you that for some time after I finished the book, and the American publisher was putting pressure on me, we need a title already. And so I thought about it and talked endlessly with friends. Everybody had different ideas. And finally I thought, okay, I think I know in my heart what the right title for this book is. And so I went to the publisher and I said, I have the title, but it's a Hebrew word. And they looked at me and said, no, absolutely not. Gilgul. Yes, and I said to them, but this is a very special word because it means many things, and not only is it about the cycle and the wheel, but it's also, at least in Jewish mysticism, about the transmigration of the soul. And they listened to me and they tried to be generous about it and they tried to imagine this title, but eventually they just kept saying, when we think of this word, it sounds to us like a dragon. It sounds to us like a science fiction book about medieval times. We cannot call the book this, so you have to come up with something else. And so in due time, the Dante came to me, but just to finish that story, in the week before this book was published in the States, a friend who had been with me through this whole argument sent me a YouTube video. And when I opened it up, it was an episode from the television show Fargo. Anyone here familiar with that? It's a very popular now television show. And this clip was two characters in Fargo sitting at the bar, and the one says to the other, you know what this is? This is my Gilgul. And the other one says, you're what? And he says, it's a Hebrew word. It means a cycle or a wheel. It actually means, in a mystical sense, the transmigration of the soul. And I thought to myself, what? You know, and because my argument to the publisher had been, this is what literature does. Literature brings us words for things that we don't yet have. And either the word comes from a foreign language or it's a word that's coined by the writer. But my example to them was, in English, we didn't know what a golem was until Isaac Bashevis Singer wrote a story. And now we know, and we have the word, and we have the whole concept, and it adds to our sense of what the world contains. And so I said to them, I promise you, if we call the novel this, you will see that there will be an article, I don't know, Vanity Fair or something like that, and the title will be something like Trump's Gilgul. You know what I mean? And they laughed. They thought, there's no way. And it was just so interesting that things do find their way. They do find their way into the language by Fargo, by television, or by, even if they don't make it the way that the author wanted it. So.
But it's interesting, another detour, but then you have to
yes,
answer.
and I'll answer the question.
Is that there is a forest in the book, and
yes.
the forestry part of it is a large part.
So to arrive at that, once I knew that I had to find another title, again, it's amazing how that happens when we make things out somewhere from underneath, from the unconscious. The answer always rises up. Maybe we knew it all the time and we couldn't access it. It's hard, but those lines from Dante, which I had read in college, and I studied the Divine Comedy in college, for many years I hadn't thought about them, and they just came to me, and I had to actually go to the book to make sure that I was remembering them right. And of course, the novel was not only filled with forests, but it filled with the idea, as you suggest, of getting lost. And the particular thing that's interesting to me about forests and the idea of the forest through sort of cultural human history is the forest is a place where mystery happens. It's the place, it's the location of the unknown. It's where magic can happen, confusion, darkness. It is outside of the law, right? There's danger to it. In a sense, it's like it stands in opposition to the city. And the city is that thing which is a reflection of human order, the human desire to create order. And the forest is the thing where our order is useless. And so I already had that idea of the forest and its uncertainty, its unknowability, as being something that these characters and I as a writer were moving toward. There's a moment very, very early on in the book in which one of the characters is talking about Descartes, the philosopher. And Descartes, of course, is at least in part the foundation on which our modern notion of the rational individual as the basis of sort of society comes from. And Descartes talked about exactly that, finding a straight line out of the forest as I just described it. And this character says, every time I read that, I hate it because I have the feeling all I want is to get lost in that forest. And so there was that forest, and there was the forest that another character decides that he eventually is going to try to plant in memory of his parents in the desert. So in a sense, the book was filled with forests, it was filled with those ideas, but only very late did I find the lines from Dante and the phrase itself that could then somehow be the title of the book.
So that first character that you're talking about is actually your character.
They're all my characters.
But it's a character called Nicole, and she's a writer. And she seems to be having at least a part of your own life. And if we take the Dante quote as describing a midlife crisis, midway upon the journey of our life, then my feeling was, and maybe it was my own personal feeling because I'm almost your age, I think I'm a year older than you are, was that you're describing my midlife crisis. And I was wondering, how close is the character of Nicole to the writer Nicole?
So I have many, many things to say about that, and it always seems to be the most pressing question that readers have. And I'll just back up before I answer to say that last week, before I came to Israel, I went to go visit Philip Roth, who is an old friend and who was with me through many ways of writing this book, where I would speak to him about it. And I was speaking to him about this problem, as I see it, the problem that always happens where no matter what we write, right, there's always the urge to read it autobiographically, to believe that the fiction is real, and why that's so gratifying to us as readers. And he told me something wonderful that I have to share with you, which is that he, at some point in his career, this aggravated him so much that in the beginning of every interview with a journalist, he would say, "Every single thing in this book happened to me. Every last thing in this book happened to me, if only in words. Now what do you want to know?"
But this is one of the, and Philip Roth gave you a great quote, which is on the cover of the book. A brilliant novel, I am full of admiration. I share this sentiment. But also I think this is the thing that is true for Philip Roth, and maybe now it will start being true for you, that he takes us with him in his journey of life.
Yes, but what I would say is that we do that no matter who our characters are. And so I would, when I'm said to you, but they're all my characters, part of what the desire to call this character Nicole was not actually to invite you as the reader to read this autobiographically. for me, it's a larger question, and it begins many, many years ago. I've been writing novels for 16 years, and what I can tell you about writing novels is that something you probably know as readers, which is when we become a character, equally when we're writing and creating the character as when we read a character and identify it, deeply empathize with the character, we become them. They meld with our own sense of who we are, they become part of us, and they add facets, they add dimension to our sense of ourself. So we have a very rich sense of the flexibility of the self when we're in the realm of literature, as readers and as writers. And so when I write a story about an old man, as I've done maybe too many times to count now, I don't feel that I'm just writing from off to the side story of man. I feel I became him, and he is part of me, and he is an aspect of me, and he expresses an aspect of me. And what I notice is that time and time again, we leave the writing room, or we close the book, and we return to life, to reality, that knowledge that we have as readers in the realm of literature somehow vanishes, and we go back to this sense of the self as something kind of static and somewhat fixed. And I question that because I think that we only need to look a little bit under the surface of that to know, actually, it's not true at all. We know that the self is a story, right? And I can sketch that out for you by saying, well, think about from the beginning of your lives, the story of who you are probably started like with your parents, right? With your mother or your father saying, you are like this and your brother is like that. And the story begins there, and your teachers and your friends and everybody adds to this. And it is what we do because we're human beings. Our memories are always engaged in this creative act of redrawing, retranscribing the past in order to fit a coherent story of the self. And this is what the human mind needs above all else. So if you read any neuroscience, if you read about anything that is on the subject of how memory works, it will tell you that. And in fact, it is what makes us healthy, right? Freud would tell you that pathology happens when we are unable to retranscribe memories, right? So, and scientists will tell us we do not have historical truth. We have no access to objective historical truth. The only truth we have is narrative truth. So the self is a story. I just gave you a lecture on it, but you all know it. You always know it. The self is a story that we tell ourselves. So why is it that when we leave the realm of art and we go back into the realm of so-called reality, we return to this much narrower idea of what it is to be the self? Why don't we use this knowledge of its flexibility when the story of who we are grows too narrow, it no longer fits us, we need different kinds of freedoms? And so to call this character Nikolle is in a sense not a provocation about, here, I now hold you not responsible for thinking about what this is about. This is just a story of me. It's something much harder than that to say, I'm inviting you into a conversation and I will use myself as a guinea pig. So here I am, right? Here are the broad strokes of my life as you probably might recognize them. I'm a writer, I live in Brooklyn, I have 2 boys, I was in a marriage. And here are some of the things from my life that began to happen to me. But the things that happen to this character are ultimately quite surreal, quite extraordinary. And if you are a reader who has some sense of the world and reality, you must know that they become fictional. And so you are invited into this question of how are we going to begin with the simple story of the self, and how are we going to, in the realm of these pages, going to expand it until it fits this character better, and how can we do this outside of literature in our own lives?
So one of the first things that this character, the writer Nikolle, goes through is her, as things fall apart, so does her ability, or so she says, to write stories, or to even believe in stories, or in any form of literature falls apart. So we go with you, the writer and the character, through this whole phase of disbelief, of being able to create again, or what's the sense of even creating this narrative or this story if the whole world falls apart? But this is not my question. My question is that eventually when she decides to hold on to something, it is the Hilton Hotel. So after her whole world collapses, she goes to the Hilton Hotel in Tel Aviv, which is the one stable, maybe, thing that existed from her childhood, maybe from your own childhood. And there at the Hilton, she sits and tries to figure out, why is she there? What is the meaning of this place to her, for her? And I was wondering, did you find out the answer to this question? Because I have so many things that are connected in my mind associatively to the Hilton Hotel, and I'm sure many of the people here, if they come from Tel Aviv or are just Israelis, also have their own associations, but they're not in the book.
Right. Well, what I would say about it, first to the first part of your question, which is really about a part of the subject of the book, which is what are the advantages? There's no question that we need narrative, so I don't think that this book it wants to betray that need or even question the need for narrative. But this character who we're talking about, Nיקol, finds herself at a moment in which the forms of her life, those stories, but also just simply the form of wife, mother, the form of daughter, those that we choose and those that we're given.
The conventions.
And the conventions and the form of her work as a writer, which is narrative, have grown too narrow for her. And so she is trying, you meet her at the moment in which she is trying to find her courage to break those forms. What happens when we break a form? It isn't that just everything falls apart and we're formless, but we must be formless for as long as it takes to find a new and authentic and better fitting form. It isn't that we just can be as a human formless, right? So, and we know that cycle exists in nature. We see it in nature all the time, the way that form takes shape, it's destroyed, and it's regenerated into new life. Every fall we see this form. Right, exactly. And we feel that in nature, but we're terrified to do it in our own lives. I think all of us to some degree or other, because as much as we want freedom and growth and change, as much as the need for change is written into us as a species, we also need stability and we need certainty. And so I was trying to write about a character who is trying to find the courage to turn away from certainty. So if you don't want to talk about forms, we can also talk away from certainties that in a sense no longer apply to her or limit her, and to have the courage to turn toward uncertainty, to turn toward formlessness. And just to back up even a little bit more, in the beginning of writing this book, that was already before I had the characters, I knew that this turning toward uncertainty, turning toward the unknowable, was going to be important to me. I found myself thinking a lot about how we are living in a time in which we are obsessed with a certain kind of knowledge. We're obsessed with information, and we're obsessed with the fact that we can Google everything and all of the known world is accessible to us. And the more I think about this obsession with a certain kind of knowledge, the more it betrays, in my mind, an anxiety, the anxiety of not knowing. And we live in obviously a very anxious time. And the more I thought about that, the more I thought about how historically there has always been, in earlier periods of our history, there has always been some ritualized turning toward the unknowable. And that turning toward the unknowable is what fills us with wonder and awe and allows us to be changed. So that in this turning our backs on that, in our equating the unknowable with, I don't know, ignorance or something like that, and our set obsession with knowing everything and the value of knowing everything, we become so certain that we don't open ourselves to some kind of ability to be altered, that we long for.
And I think that you're also, another aspect of that is you talk a lot about the unheimlich, the Freudian term of the known thing that maybe you repress and becomes known again to you in familiar circumstances, which brings me again to the Hilton. Because
Sorry,
I
the
have
Hilton,
to
yes.
say, I'll just share with you what I feel about the Hilton. I mean, for us, I guess for most people who live here or live in Tel Aviv, Hilton is an American hotel built on a Muslim cemetery. And right next door to it is the Independence Garden, which used to be a place of transgression because it used to be a gay park for gay people, for homosexuals to meet at the times where this activity was illegal. So it's called the Independence Garden because of Israel's independence, not because of gay independence. And there's the Muslim cemetery that used to be there, and on top of all that comes the American capitalism.
Yeah. I think in those readings make a certain kind of sense in this book, even if they're not on the surface, because this writer, Nיקול, is drawn to the Hilton not because of
any of that, actually.
No, not because of any of that, but also not because of what one might think about it when one looks at this building. Let's put all of its history aside, and let's just simply look at it as a structure, which is how it's first introduced in the book. There are photographs of it. Remember, this is written for many people who will never come to Tel Aviv and would never know what the Hilton looks like. But whether you know it or not, to simply really look at that building and you see this monstrosity, this intense grid. It is a form, when we're talking about forms, it is a form that seems so fixed, so unerring, so unchanging, and so without flexibility. It's this grid, right? And yet this character, as a writer, is drawn to it. And the question is why? It seems in some senses the opposite of that. And it is because in her mind, her associations with that place where she's been going, yes, as I have been going since I was a child, her parents, like my parents, were married there, and she thinks she was probably conceived there. But most importantly, her experiences at that hotel as a child, in a sense, tested the boundaries of conventional reality in a way that a million experiences we all have as children tested. And as children, we have no problem with it, because as children, we're not yet schooled enough in convention that we can't hold the contradiction in our minds. So extraordinary things happen to us as children, and only as we get a little bit older do we rationalize them out of existence into some, that's why that happened or whatever. But her experience of that place is that it almost is a kind of portal to, if not other worlds, and that's why I think it's sort of significant to what you're saying, that building becomes a portal to this historical different stories that are
underground.
Exactly, but it's not just a portal to other worlds, but a portal to otherworldliness. And she even imagines, she starts to imagine this idea: what if all of us were dreaming our lives from one place, one banal place in this world, but what if all of us are laying and dreaming our life? And she says she knows immediately that if it were true, her place would be this hotel. And so in a sense, she's trying to go back to the source, and she's trying to go back to a place in her prehistory which comes before certain kinds of fixed conventional ideas of what reality should be. And isn't that what we always do as writers? Isn't that what we always do when we enter, and readers, when we enter into the parallel world of literature, which has enormous relevance and connection to this world, but is not this world. And it is a world where we go to deliver truths about this reality, this world, but where we have enormous flexibility for magical, extraordinary things to happen, and we agree and we allow for them to happen, and we allow for ourselves to see this window onto infinity that happens in art and literature that we don't allow most of the time in our lives. So that, in that sense, her pursuit of this place is about the pursuit of those ideas.
And then I thought that also her coming as an American Jew to Israel, to find her roots or maybe her authenticity. And you deal in many various and interesting and even contradictory ways in the connection of the diaspora Jew to the Zionistic Jew, and the connection of American Jews to Israel. And I think that perhaps, and also it connects to this whole thing of telling a narrative, of telling a story. I mean, she comes here to Israel to write her story or her novel, but then she gets recruited by an Israeli in order to write another chapter maybe of the Jewish story. And you describe, I mean, I wish we could just read all those pages describing it, but I'll try to somehow shorten it up. But he talks to her, this guy, Eliezer Friedman, who maybe was in the Mossad, and maybe he's a professor of literature, and maybe doesn't even exist. But he talks to her about her role as a Jewish female writer in a long tradition. I mean, in your book, you give so many names of our long tradition of Jewish male writers. You start by Pinchas Sadeh, and then you mention Brenner, and then, of course, there's Kafka. So Eliezer Friedman invites her to write the last chapter of Kafka's play, or maybe of Kafka's life. So coming here to do this, really everything to me connects somehow. And she's coming here to write her own story, but also the national story.
Well, she doesn't feel she is. He feels she is. And I think she makes a lot of, she scoffs at that in a lot of ways. And I mean, but it was an opportunity for me as a writer to address some of those ideas. Like, what does it mean to have the expectation that you are part, as a Jewish writer, you are contributing to the Jewish story? And there's so many ways to look at it, and there's so many ways in which instinctively I would want to resist that, as she resists that. And kind of comedy is made of it, because he says to her at some point, you know, you think your writing belongs to you, and she says, who else does it belong to? And he says, to the Jews. And she laughs at him because it seems absurd. And it is in some sense, but then he backtracks and says, but wait, really, let's think about this. Isn't it the case that beginning with the Torah, beginning with the earliest stories we told as Jews about ourselves, that we were creating who we were? We know that back then, actually, we were like a backwater nation. Nobody could have expected that we would have had that kind of influence on 2,000 years of civilization. And the reason we did, at least in his argument of it, the reason we did is because at just the moment in which humanity was coming into written language, the ability to tell complex stories in writing, we seized this opportunity. We weren't the first people to come up with the idea of monotheism and one God, but we seized the opportunity to write about, with passion, with tenderness, with brilliance, our particular struggle to stay true to that. And in doing so, we bought ourselves this future. We give ourselves this future of being able to live on this land, and many, many, many other things. We made ourselves who we are.
We wrote ourselves into
into
past
being.
and future.
And this was an act in if you look at it and how this was put together and how it was edited and the redactors work and all of that, this is an act of self-creation, as writing always is. And then to which the character Nikola laughs and says it sounds more like Jewish PR than anything else. And so there's a constant conflict between them about his aspirations and her own sense of who she is and what she wants. But just again to add to the second part of what or the first part, I can't remember where it was, of what you said, this idea that she is going to Israel to write her story, more authentic story, I wouldn't put it exactly that way. What I would say is that this is a book which is very, very much about the notion of a divided self, of being here and there, right? So the earliest, we haven't even talked about the story of Epstein yet. There's two narratives in the novel, and they're constantly alternating. We'll get to it. But the Nicole's part opens with two stories. One is her earliest memory, and her earliest memories of being 2.5 years old, and seeing herself on the television in a children's TV show and knowing she was never there. So her earliest foundational memory is of seeing herself, understanding with this sense of the Unheimlich, that I am here and there, and I was never there, but I know in my gut that that is me. I know from the look in her eyes that that is what it is to be me. She's wearing my clothes, whatever it is. And then a few pages later, she comes home into her house, she walks into her house, and she has this, again, this skin-crawling sensation that she is somehow already there in the house, upstairs, asleep, doing the washing, something. But she has this feeling for the first time in her life that who she is doesn't end at the extremities of her fingers and her feet, but that she goes on again somewhere else, upstairs, elsewhere. And what she's getting at in all of that is this notion of what it is to live being in two or many places at once, because the idea of the multiverse comes into this too. And I think that you can look at this in many ways. One way is to say this is a universal thing, whether you're Jewish or not Jewish. Everybody knows what it was at some point in your life. You turned left, and you met the person you ended up marrying, or you moved to a different country, or you got that job, or you met the professor who changed your life, and then you studied that. But you could have gone right. And the quote-unquote memory or projection of what would have happened to you telescopically in your life if you had turned right is a counter life, and it lives with you. And we go on. So we can think about that in a universal sense in which we're here, but all the other possibilities of our life are there, ongoing, living with us. Or you can look at it, as I do at times, in the Jewish sense, which is to grow up, particularly in the diaspora, and you are here, but especially in my own family's case, you are also always there in Israel. Israel was always the other place. It's the only geographical constant in my family, in 4 generations of my family's life. Everybody came from everywhere, but everybody always went to Israel to fall in love, to get married, to die, all of those things, important things that one goes to do. And so, but there was always a question of what would have happened if I had grown up there. What is that other life that's over there? And in fact, whether you're American and have a relationship to Israel or not, every year at the Seder you say next year in Jerusalem, as I suppose you say here as well, right? But that idea of the Jewish sense of whether it's contemporary or whether we go back in time, of always being both in this reality and that other idea of the reality, I think is deep, and the book is shot through with ideas of that. So when Nיקol goes to Israel, it isn't just to tell the more authentic story of herself. In a sense, it's to create this larger whole, and to embody the there for a little while, even if the here is inescapable.
Maybe we'll read some parts of the book after another song by Daniela.
I love you. No, you don't. No, you don't. No, you don't. No, you don't love me. All you love is your love. wish you had. I wish you had. I wish you had. I wish you had. All you need is a wall to bounce your ball against you. So cut it out.
So there is another character in the maybe the main character. I don't know. They're both main characters. Epstein. Epstein?
I love how you call him Epstein. Everybody in Israel should call him Epstein, I know. So I call him Epstein, but some people call him Epstein, so what's the difference?
Yeah. So the book actually opens with Epstein or Epstein, who is a rich Jewish man from New York. Yeah, from New York. Who goes through a late life crisis, which starts after reading, you don't say the name, but I gather it's Pinchas Sadeh, Achaim Kamashal.
I want to just interrupt you to say one thing about that, which is it's only 3 lines that are quoted from that book, but my assumption was, somebody, obviously people in Israel will recognize that, but when the first review came out of this novel, it was long and it was beautiful and written by a very intelligent woman, but the end of the review was all about how there's a long line in my work and in other people's work of making up novels that become significant. And the whole thing was about how this novel, without question, was made up. And I ended up writing to her and saying, you're absolutely wrong and you should go read it. You know, this book exists and it's beautiful. But it never even occurred to me.
I wouldn't know him from the 3 lines. Right. I knew him because you said born in Poland, wrote the first book when he was 27. Right. Then
because
died when he was 66.
Because I give some shape of his biography, right? It seemed to me that somewhere or other, whether it was in the biography or whether it was in the lines, that there would be somehow, it would be obvious that it was a real book, but no.
I think Israeli readers will probably have a different interpretation or view of this book probably than Americans. But so this is another interesting thing for me to I mean, a writer never writes to a specific audience, or do you? I mean, did you write this more to American Jews than to Israelis?
I never write it. I was just speaking about this today. I was in Tel Aviv University today, and I think it was the first question was, do you have the reader in mind when you write? And I always have to be delicate with how to answer this question because it's actually a large question. But the simple answer is no, I don't have the reader in mind, ever, actually. And if I had the reader in mind, I would not be able to write a good book. In part because the first thing I would think about, because I'm a kind and a considerate person, is the long laundry list of grievances that the reader would have with this book. I didn't like this. I didn't this. Why was it so? Why would she so this? And so I immediately have to put aside all the, in my mind, possible complaints, let alone the things that will be loved, because one of the things I know as a reader about myself is that which I want is often not what I need to read. And I am continually surprised. The things that cause epiphany or revelation in me are the things that I didn't think that I needed and I discover in a work. And so I can't have the reader in mind. I know that doesn't make for good literature, and that isn't to erase the fact that this book is written in order with a deep and serious hope that it will be read and that it will be understood. It's just that there isn't one particular reader or an image of a reader, whether it's cultural or whether it's gendered or whether it's anything, in my mind at all when I write.
So as an Israeli, it's interesting to see how Epstein, whatever, how he sees us, and through him how you see us. So I think it's kind of a comic relief.
Yeah, I know which passage you're going to ask me to read. It's funny because this is a 254?
234.
234, that's what I thought. This passage is I've been traveling since the last week of August on tour, speaking to audiences all over the world and all over America, and this passage I've only ever been asked to read it to Jewish audiences. And this morning I was asked to read it, and it was the first time I read it to an Israeli audience. And what I found interesting, because this is a passage that is about Israelis and Americans and the American perception of Israelis, it was interesting the awkward moments of this passage in American JCCs and the awkward moments for the Israelis. So we'll see which moments are awkward and which are comic for you. So 234, this is...
Yeah, I actually highlighted because I wanted to skip from the good part to the bad.
To the bad part. I think we might have to read it. Let's see, let's try. Yeah, I think we can. Okay, we can.
Sorry, it's my...
No problem. No, this is perfect. So this is a moment in the book in which Epstein has decided that he's not going back to America, not for now at least. I should also say the book opens with his disappearance in the desert, in the Judean desert. So we know from the beginning that he disappears, and in a sense, his part of this novel is our discovery of what happened to him. And so this is after the knowledge of his disappearance, but before he has, we've backtracked to his story. So he's in Israel. He's given away. This is a man of absolute authority, of absolute certainty, a hugely successful New York attorney who has amassed considerable material wealth, and who late in his life at 68, in the wake of both of his parents' deaths, and leaving his marriage of many decades, I suppose begins to have to face the question of what if I was wrong? I mean, what if I was wrong about the certainties on which I have staked my life? And so there's this late turning away from certainty, as we were talking about before, toward that other realm. I guess we could call it, for lack of a better word, the spiritual realm, the realm of that consideration of the unknown and the unknowable. And so he decides, he has what his lawyer calls, he catches the disease of radical charity, and he begins to give away all of his money and all of his collection of paintings to museums. And with the very last money that he has left, he wants to go to Israel, where he's been going his whole life, where he was born, where his parents came as refugees after the war. He wants to go to do something in his parents' memories, but he doesn't yet know what. And so this is a moment in which he's decided it's going to take longer than he thought. He's staying. And so he goes to an Israeli real estate agent to find a place. So this is from the real estate agent's perspective. Still, he knew better than to trust the first flush of American enthusiasm, knew how they came, and for a week fell in love with the urgency and the argument and the warmth, with the way everyone sits in the cafes and talks and gets into each other's lives, the way that even if on the outside Israel is obsessed with borders, on the inside it lives without boundaries. How there's no disease of loneliness here, and every taxi driver is a prophet, and every salesman of the shuk will tell you the story of his brother and his wife, and next thing you know, the guy behind you in line is chiming in, and soon enough the crummy quality of the towels doesn't even matter anymore, because the stories and the mess and the craziness, all of that life, are so much more essential. They come to Tel Aviv and find it so sexy, the sea and the strength, the nearness to violence, and the hunger for life, and how even if Israelis are living in an existential crisis all of the time and sense that their country is lost, at least they live in a world where everything still matters and is worth fighting for. Most of all, they fall in love with how they feel here. This is where we come from, they think. But the agent knew well that after a week or two, they start to feel differently, these Americans. The strength starts to stink of aggression, and the directness becomes pushy. It begins to grate how Israelis don't have any manners, how they have no respect for personal space, no respect for anything. And doesn't anyone do anything in Tel Aviv aside from sit around talking and going to the beach? The city really is a shithole, isn't it? Everything that isn't new is falling apart. The whole place smells of cat piss. There's a sewage problem right under the window, and no one can come for a week. And actually, Israelis are impossible to deal with, so stubborn and intractable, so frustratingly immune to logic, so damn rude. And it turns out most of them don't even care for anything Jewish. Their grandparents and parents ran as far away from it as they could, and the ones that do care, they're over the top, those settlers, totally out of their minds, and frankly, the whole country is a bunch of Arab-hating racists. And so just in the nick of time, before they put down the deposit on a 2-bedroom in the new glass high-rise going up over Neve Tzedek, it's back in the cab to the airport with their suitcases fragrant with za'atar and laden with silver Judaica from Hatzorfim and their Lexus keys newly hung on a hamsa.
They're from Jerusalem. They like it when you...
Right, I didn't take into account the inner politics of Israel. There you go.
Yeah, exactly. Bitch about Tel Aviv all you want. Actually, a part of this once makes me want to skip to my next question, even though I want to go back to Epstein. But a part of this now made me feel that maybe I know the answer to the question we were talking about outside, but I want to hear your answer. And it's, you make a connection in the book between love and violence. And at one shocking, there's one shocking statement. I mean, all throughout the book you tell about different couples, like the parents of the character of Nיקol and the parents of the character of Epstein. They're all always arguing like good old Jewish couples. And their love is always, love for them is
Conflict.
Either shouting at each other or arguing constantly or wearing each other down with. And then at one point you just say that you, your character says that she finds it hard to believe anymore in love that comes without violence.
Or that she'll never again trust a love that doesn't have violence. And we spoke about it only because I was telling you that, interestingly, it's only one line in the book, although, as you point out, there are reflections on it throughout. But the number of people who chose out that one line to ask me about it, who were bewildered by it, was really remarkable to me, because when I wrote it, it didn't occur to me that it was questionable in any way or surprising in any way. Now that I think about it, I see why. But my reading of that, the notion that I'm trying to get across is, yes, you're right, in part, this idea of a certain kind of cultural reliance on or belief in argument as the way to get at some greater truth. So we don't trust anything that doesn't arrive. We don't arrive at
as a way to get closer.
Argument. Yeah. But in a deeper sense, what that line means to me is that it is impossible to love, to truly, truly love, without letting wholly into yourself the other. And when you let wholly into yourself the other, it is inevitably violent. And it is violent because it is not what you are. What you believe, how you feel, how you were raised, what you think, your ethical sense, your sense of what's important, whatever it is, how you brush your teeth, how you floss your teeth, your sense of how you are, whether on the most trivial level or whether in the most profound level, is going to be radically questioned, or at least going to have new space for someone that you love and respect and admire who does it differently, who is different. And if you really allow that person in fully, it can't help but alter in an often violent way at the beginning. And I think that's what part of what falling in love is, who you are, who you want to be, how you think of yourself. And then when you take that at a larger and larger level, when you take it then to the political level, for example, this slowness that we have, this like recalcitrance and resistance to allowing in the news of the other, whoever the other is to us politically, is in part because it would mean we would have to rearrange our ideas about ourselves. And this is a very uncomfortable, violent thing to have to do. And so we would rather not, oftentimes. We would rather decide that what we know about the other, whether it's the political other or whether it's the person who we work with, or whatever it is, sometimes even the person we love and live with, we would rather decide that our sense of that person, our story of that person is right, and so we don't have to accommodate, or we don't have to deal with the violence of what it would be to truly, deeply allow it into ourselves. And that really was what that line and what was about in the book.
There's also the violence of parting. I mean, maybe not the violence, but maybe just the extreme pain. And there's a beautiful paragraph, but I want us to talk more than I want to. I mean, just go and read the book. So again, I'll just tell about it instead of reading it. But it's beautiful about the pain of birth, of giving birth. And I think in that part of the book, it's also connected to just the pain of parting, of like physical pain you feel when you part, when you have to be torn away from somebody. And to me, those two were very similar in that area in the book, when the character is alone in the desert and is going through some illness that is maybe more mental or
well, it's a
spiritual.
fever. What happens when we have a fever is that we often lose our sense of reality, right? We begin to hallucinate, and she's going through this feverish experience that is about epiphany, I suppose, in that sense. But the section that's about physical pain, that's about childbirth, to me, as I was writing it, and this doesn't, I don't mean to discount how you see it, because I think it's valid always, but what interested me about writing about that was this idea she has, which is that she no longer fears physical pain, that the most radical physical pain happened to her when she gave birth to her children. And she describes how after it happened, immediately her friend called, how was it? And she doesn't even know how to describe it. And she says, she thinks to herself, it was like meeting myself in the valley of hell. And you know what I mean? I know something about myself now, what I'm capable of and what I can survive in that sense. And she describes that she had these, very, very big babies, and the pain of that was huge. But she's really talking about about courage in some sense, courage to face pain, and how she still at that moment also has fear, though, of emotional pain, both the potential of her own and what she might inflict on others.
And I think the two characters, Epstein and Nicole, are constantly going towards, they're doing an almost Buddhistic thing. Epstein is obviously doing something Buddhistic because he's feeling the emptiness and meaninglessness of maybe his way of life, of accumulating wealth. And then he does this Buddhistic thing of giving away everything that he has, and then he goes into the unknown. And Nicole, in a way, does the same thing of going. They're both, and it's referred also in another part, they're both standing on the threshold of the underworld or hell or pain or suffering, and going there.
Or something, or what's beyond it. Because I think what I would want to say is that it is incredibly painful, as we were speaking before, it's incredibly painful to break a form that you have held for a long time. And once it happens and you go through the pain, there's also the liberation of that, the freedom of this new possibility. And we all know both of those positions very, very well. But these are cycles that we go through. We have to always go through in our lives, maybe not as radically as Epstein and Nicole go through, but we all, whether we want to or not, we have to, in a sense. And so I don't necessarily think of them, it's interesting you chose the word threshold, because I think you were thinking of the section of the book that has to do with Kafka, right? And at one point, Nicole is talking about how in Kafka, one is always on the threshold of the beyond, the other world, the sublime, but one never can cross it. There's that beautiful story about being at the door of the law, right? And he never can go through to the other side. And at the end, just before he's an old man before he dies, the doorkeeper says to him, this door was only for you, and now we're going to shut it forever. So the sense that there is this possibility for transcendence, for becoming that. But at least in Kafka's writing, often in Nicole's experience of it, is that there's this frustration of never being able to cross over. But I think if this book is about characters on that threshold, I don't really think of it only as the threshold of pain. Certainly, I don't think of it as hell, but I think of it in the threshold of what it takes to gather courage and belief that there is some beyond. There is some beyond that we can somehow cross over in this life in order to expand, to grow, to evolve.
So did you feel that as you were writing this book or after you finished it, you did go into a mystical...
A mystical trance?
or did you just go straight back into...
I think it was really, there was a lot of energy in writing this book. I think there were times I found it, like every book I've written, extremely painful to write, but there were many, many times where it felt extraordinarily freeing to write this book, and a kind of exuberance that was powering the writing of it, because it was about something that I felt and feel so strongly about. And I don't think there's any answer to that. Like that. I mean, there's always that sense of, well, we don't ever arrive, because the moment you get through that and you arrive at a new form, it's like the clock begins to tick. For how long will that form or that choice or that way of being fit you? And if you are someone who becomes used to the possibility to change your life, and as a writer, that's what I do in my work. For 16 years, I've been changing my life. I become other people, just like you become other people. When you read, so in a sense, I am. It is so deeply written into my sense of the world that every time I pick up the proverbial pen, I am seizing the opportunity at changing myself in some way, growing myself. So I already know that experience well, and I also know that the moment the changes happen, as I said, the clock begins to tick, for how long that will work. And so each novel has to become a total reevaluation and a total change, and a new kind of breaking of form to something else. And I think, that way of living isn't easy, but it becomes, to me at least, it feels the most authentic.
So I'm wondering now, who did you start this book with? Epstein or Nicole?
I think that we were talking about this, how long the book took me to write, about 3.5 years, but I think that both the seeds of both Epstein and Nicole were with me for much longer. So I think they both were kind of born as characters or situations. Right after I finished Great House, and what happens after I finish a novel is I don't stop writing, I just am writing in search of the next thing that feels alive to me. And so the next thing that feels urgent or worth spending years writing a novel about. And so I wrote a lot of things, and Epstein and his disappearance in the desert, and this idea of this character who is so certain and so authoritative, but who has this fracture that occurs in him, in which that begins to become undone. I think that was with me since, yes, about 7-8 years ago or something. And the same with Nicole. The story of Nicole evolved because I had that experience. I had the experience of what it was to have my mind fixated on this idea of trying to write a novel that was set in the Hilton or use the structure of the Hilton, and I couldn't get anywhere with it. And I would keep going up to my desk every day to write, and so I thought, at least let me chronicle this particular experience. And so out of that became a flexibility grew, and she became fiction and this story. And then for a while I had both of them, but I had a million other things that I was thinking about in writing too. And at some point, I don't know when exactly, maybe because of the geography of their story, I saw them in juxtaposition, in constellation. I think I just instinctively understood that they were parts of a whole. And once I knew that, the book began to be written.
I have so many other questions I want to ask you, but now we're nearing the end, I think. Or I think we have the 10 minutes that I promised you to ask questions are now. So do you have any questions?
I was wondering about a number of threads in the book seem to sort of just trail off and I was wondering, what was your process of bringing those threads to begin and then sort of having them just sort of disappear and not be
What
resolved.
trails off? What disappears?
What?
I didn't notice anything that trails off and disappeared. Right. I mean,
Well, for example, the film doesn't get made.
oh, well, you're
The-
talking about a narrative, a plot line that,
Yes.
that comes to it.
Yes.
Well, this is always just a question of a lens, right? Like we want to tell the story of your life right now. Well, we're not going to tell it from to get the most meaningful story we can tell about your life. We're not going to tell everything linearly from the time of your birth to your future. We're going to choose moments of your life, and we're going to rope them together and juxtapose them to tell something about the deeper meaning, hopefully, ideally, of who you are. So this is the same thing when a writer tells a story. Narratively, where we choose to tell it, what aspect of the story, which bit of it we tell and which we leave untold, which in a sense isn't the point. I don't look at literature as its work being to tell us a story from beginning to end. I look at it as the thing we turn to understand, to ask questions, and hopefully to mean more, to mean better, right? And so when you first ask your question and I say, what trails off, it's because every last idea in this book is considered and thought out and comes to completion. And to me, in my mind, as I wrote it, and all of the meaning of it is there for you to find and to read. So when you say, you didn't personally say this, but somebody might say, well, what did happen to Epstein? Or I thought these stories were going to touch these two narratives. Why didn't they touch? It's unresolved. And I would say, really? This book is a whole. Not every single page is sewn together in such a way that makes a whole. So it doesn't, whether or not they touch, which they do, by the way, but that's neither here nor there. But whether or not they touch or ever meet narratively on the highest, most superficial, when I say highest, I mean superficial level of plot, to me is not very important. What they touch and touch and touch again on every page in a kind of subterranean way, in terms of how, in a metaphysical sense, I guess you could say. And I assure you that there's nothing in this book that I allowed to just trail off.
So, thank you very much.
Thank
This is
you.
very
Thank you
interesting
for
evening.
having me.
Thank you. And we have 2 more songs, so Daniela.
I think it was beautiful. You speak beautifully, really. It was very inspiring.
All of an al Hiroshima.
כל הדברים היפים באמת מתגלים בזמנם האיטי הבלתי מתחשב. כל הדברים היפים באמת מתגלים בזמנם האיטי הבלתי מתחשב. של הלב. תודה רבה. Thank you very much.